B, the fact that right now there is a urgent need to revive the economy and stroke consumption. Where will government get all the money from? Because your fiscal deficit number on paper is looking okay, the inside story is different, and in order to really keep the economy going and reviving the rural economy, government will have to open their spending, and right now the elbow room is just not there.
Right. I think one of the first things that people are going to look at is the budget, and I think the emphasis will be on credibility of numbers. We know the interim budget numbers. We also now know that there has been a slippage on the revenue side. The direct as well as indirect taxes have been short, and we also know that the government has committed certain line items on the expenditure side. So yes, there is some bit of anxiety and quite a bit of interest on how the government is going to total the budget arithmetic. And I think the first of these will be the budget that we are expecting in the first week of July. And I think if they are able to come up with credible numbers, of course, first thing is that there should be no slippage from the number that they've given, 3.4% of GDP. And at the same time, I think the emphasis should be on the revenue side. If they're able to give these numbers, I'm expecting some cuts on the direct tax numbers, and also therefore the emphasis shifts on getting the GST compliance and the numbers that people have been looking at. The second bit is expenditure. One part is only the quantification of the number, but the other part is also the quality of expenditure. And I think what we've seen so far, and almost all years, is that capital expenditure gets sacrificed in the last quarter to meet some of these numbers. So I think the emphasis will squarely be on fiscal management to begin with. And I think that is where people will start getting the comfort if the numbers look credible. The other piece is, what are the assumptions apart from the revenue on the expenditure side in terms of oil prices? We know oil prices are close to 38-39% this calendar year higher, and therefore I think the entire subsidy math and the assumptions will also be a critical part. And from there on, I think we'll move on to some of these medium term targets that the government has lined out in terms of the manifesto promises.
Okay, my next question is, this government has been extremely, or NDA 1 has been extremely lucky with low inflation. I mean, inflation for NDA 1 regime was south of 5%. That may not be the scenario going forward, because if the rural economy has to make a comeback, MSP pricing has to go higher. If MSP pricing has to go higher, inflation will go higher. Inflation goes higher, Reserve Bank of India will not cut rates. So it's like, you know, so frankly, from an outsider's perspective, the economy is stuck between rock and a hard surface.
Absolutely. I think the inflation story is not as simple as it seems. We need to understand that the farmers are also producers. And if you look at the terms of trade for the farm side and the inflation story, I think we need to understand that the incomes in nominal terms have not really gone up, because inflation has actually averaged, if I just take WPI for the last 5 years, it's averaged about 1%, sorry. And that means that the incomes in nominal terms, or the realizations for the farmer, have not really grown. I mean, it's been static for the last 5 years. And that means that while the consumer on the urban side has benefited from this, the farmer, who's also a producer of these food prices, has actually been hit, and it is leading to quite a bit of the agrarian distress that we keep talking about. And it is this balancing act, therefore, which becomes really critical. So yes, we understand that when we came into this cycle, 2014-15, we were having an impact of inflation. It was in double digits prior to that, and the government actually had to curtail it via lower MSP hikes, interest rate hikes, etc. But now I think the tide has turned completely. We are seeing depressed farm incomes. The government is trying to do its bit in terms of direct cash transfers, trying to do farm loan waivers in terms of state governments. So there is quite a bit of this income transfer which is to make up for the lost realizations over the last 5 years. And I think we need to look at the food versus non-food component as well. The entire inflation collapse story so far has been the collapse of food prices, and that has hurt the farmer. But if you look at the non-food part, I think you just look at the core inflation numbers. Yes, it's begun to decline a bit, but I think it's been close to, if I take an average of a long period, close to 5%. So the terms of trade has to be looked at more granularly. And yes, you're right. If there is this cumulative impact of farm loan waivers, if there is this direct cash transfers, 75,000 crore worth, I think you are looking at some bit of inflation creeping in back in the system, and that will make the job of the RBI tougher over a period of time. But having said that, I don't really see how the RBI is going to be discomforted, at least this calendar year. I think most people are looking at an average of close to 4% or 4.5% if you take some of these outliers as well, which I think leaves some room for the RBI to cut rates in the near term. What we expect is another 25 basis points cut in June, and maybe there is some room later on depending on the distribution of the monsoon as we go forward.
But Sachchidanand, don't you think more critical would be than the rate cut would be what the RBI or MPC chooses to do when it comes to liquidity? Because I think part of the resolution of this consumption slowdown is also liquidity in the system. So I think in that sense, what the MPC needs to address more importantly and primarily is liquidity in the system. What do you think the plan, or rather they would do when 6th of June the MPC meets?
I think the first thing is we need to understand the rates part, which is cost of funds, where the RBI has already cut by 50 basis points, but the transmission has been just about 5-6 basis points if you look at the banking system. We are anticipating another 50 basis points cut, and that can be accelerated, and this is where we believe that the June policy, we will see some of these guidelines coming up on the transmission, which will accelerate the transmission part. Coming to the availability of liquidity, I think that's an important point. The RBI has been trying to address it. We have seen OMOs, timely OMOs, and also the dollar rupee swap that the RBI has come up with. So the RBI is also trying to address the liquidity bit over time. But I think we need to distinguish a little bit here in terms of the liquidity challenge. Is it really a liquidity challenge, or is it a trust deficit and solvency issue in the NBFC space, which is creating problems on the demand side? And I think the consumer or the consumption piece is also getting hurt by some of this trust deficit and solvency issues in the NBFCs, which I think can be addressed by the RBI if they come up with a special liquidity window and the cumulative impact of the transmission mechanism. And I think that will probably go a long way in addressing some of these problems. But having said that, the peculiar problem within NBFCs also, I don't really think it's a very generic problem. It is confined in small niches, like lenders that have lent to the housing or developer finance kind of niches. And there I think the structural resolution will come by only with time as the underlying property markets and the rates, the inventory is correct. So there are two parts, as I said. One is the short term, where the RBI will cut rates, accelerate transmission by way of guidelines, and make available liquidity in a timely fashion through OMOs and the dollar rupee swap. But the underlying, I think the structural issues will take time to get addressed.
For joining us today and sharing your thoughts with us, Sachchidanand, good to have you with us.